Presbyterian church where I grew up, we didn't celebrate Christ the King Sunday. I'd never even heard of it till I was in my 20s and started attending chapel services during graduate school. The dean of that chapel was an Episcopalian priest, so we followed the Episcopal Church calendar, which included on the last Sunday of the liturgical year, which is the last Sunday before Advent begins, so that's today. That included the Feast of Christ the King. And today is Christ the King Sunday. Now, I don't know whether it was that high church language that the Episcopalians are so good at in their Book of Common Prayer, or the soaring vaulted ceilings and stone arches in that enormous Gothic chapel, that everything in those services seemed to me to have this solemn gravitas of ancient rituals from the earliest days of Christianity, including Christ the King Sunday. So imagine my surprise when I learned just this week that the Feast of Christ the King is not an ancient tradition at all. In fact, it's less than 100 years old. It was instituted in the Roman Catholic Church by Pope Pius XI in 1925, and it wasn't recognized by us Protestants until the 1970s. Pope Pius XI instituted the celebration of the Feast of Christ the King in 1925 in response to the devastation of Europe that had happened in World War I, and the rise of dictators and dangerous nationalist movements that were popping up in its aftermath. Amidst all that chaos and the economic crisis that was roiling and colonialism, amidst all the Kaisers and kings and czars of that time, and as the seeds of evil that would eventually produce the terror of the Holocaust in World War II were being planted, the Pope felt it was important to reassert that earthly leaders like Tsar Ferdinand, I didn't even know who he was from Bulgaria, or Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, weren't kings in the way that Christ is king. Both the word Tsar and Kaiser, by the way, are just European versions of the word Caesar, which would have been a word Jesus was very familiar with. So it's been 100 years, almost to the day, since World War I ended. Do we really still need a yearly reminder of Christ the King? I think we do. For though Tsar Ferdinand and Kaiser Wilhelm have long since gone the way of all flesh, our 21st century world still has plenty of contenders for the man who would be king or the woman who would be queen. And as Christians, we have to keep our allegiance clear, while avoiding the many temptations to crown someone or something else besides Christ as the ruler of our hearts, our homes, our bank accounts, or priorities. And that is trickier than it sounds. We human beings, even we sophisticated, tech-savvy, postmodern, 21st century human beings, are so easily distracted and seduced and led astray. We're like kittens, really, who scamper after whatever shiny thing is dangled in front of us. A perfect example? What holiday did we just celebrate on Thursday? Thanksgiving, right. And what holiday, in quotes, did we celebrate 24 hours later? Black Friday. Isn't it odd that after devoting a day to being grateful for the things in life that truly matter, we would then spend the very next day buying stuff that truly does not matter? I am certain that the Carhartt hat I bought for my brother for Christmas doesn't matter as much as giving thanks for the fact that he's been here for the past 3 weeks. On Thursday, we said we have all we need. And the next day, we said we need all that we do not have. Like I said, we're the kittens, and we are suckers for shiny objects. Today's gospel lesson tells the story of another Black Friday, or as we usually call it, Good Friday. Didn't you find it strange that on this Sunday in November, tucked in between Thanksgiving and the first Sunday in Advent, the lectionary suddenly lurches away from all the stories about Jesus' ministry that we've been hearing from Mark all summer and all fall, and suddenly it throws throws us into the middle of the Gospel of John's account of Jesus' last morning on earth. Out of nowhere. After he's eaten the Last Supper, he's been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, put through a religious trial, handed over to Roman guards who brutally beat him, and finally to where we find him in this morning's lesson, brought before Pontius Pilate for a political trial. There he stands in shackles, a bloody and battered prisoner, abandoned by those who said they loved him, not a penny to his name, and certainly not enough money for a fancy lawyer to get him off these charges. And Pilate asks him, "So, you are a king?" Pilate's confused, because in his world, king means power and wealth and grandeur, the ability to command conquering armies. But standing in front of him is a humble, poor teacher from the boondocks. This guy, he just doesn't fit the mold. There's no obvious power. There's no prestige. He's just a helpless prisoner about to be sentenced to death without pomp or circumstance, all for claiming to his own religious leaders that he's their king, the king of the Jews. Still puzzled, Pilate asks him another question. "What have you done?" True to form, Jesus doesn't answer his question. Instead, he says, "My kingdom is not from this world. If it were, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the authorities, but as it is, my kingdom is not from here." "Okay," Pilate says, grasping at straws, "but if you say you have a kingdom, then you must be saying you are a king, right?" And for Pilate, that would seal Jesus' fate and send him straight to Golgotha, since the only real king in the world was his boss, Caesar of the Roman Empire. And anyone who claims to be a king who isn't Caesar is automatically guilty of treason and insurrection. But Jesus still refuses to answer. Instead, he says he doesn't need troops or weapons like other kings because he doesn't have that kind of kingdom to protect. His is a different kind of power, one that doesn't lie in how many soldiers he commands or the brute force he can exert or even the violent uprising he might inspire. His power comes from God. He is a king who weeps with those who mourn, seeks out those caught in death's snare and calls them to come out into new life. He's a king who condemns a religious system that leaves poor widows destitute. He saves his most passionate criticism for those who exploit the vulnerable and do so in God's name. He is a king who wears a crown of thorns and whose throne will be a cross. Dolores Williams was a professor of mine at seminary. She grew up in the South, in the Black church tradition, and she used to tell the story of Sunday mornings when she was a kid, when the minister would shout from the pulpit, "Who is Jesus?" And the choir would respond with loud, strong voices, "King of Kings and Lord Almighty." Then, Dolores said, a little old woman, in a voice so fragile and soft you could hardly hear, would sing another answer to that question, "Who is Jesus?" She would sing, "Poor Mary's little boy." Back and forth they would sing, "King of Kings" and "Poor Mary's little boy." Professor Williams would tell us, that is the Black church doing theology. Who is Jesus? King of Kings is only half the answer. Poor Mary's little boy is the other half. Another of my professors there, who was a dear friend of Professor Williams's, Barbara Lundblad, said this about her story. Those two images, King of Kings and Poor Mary's little boy, those two images clash. One is big and powerful, the other small and poor. And then she says something that Lily is going to find really interesting. Barbara says, the ancient creeds got something right when they remembered Mary and Pontius Pilate in the same breath. That's where the comma comes, for all of you who were here for the Creed series this fall. And Ever since we talked about it at Bible study, I've had a real problem with that comma, and I still do. But now when I hear Mary and Pontius Pilate in the same breath, I think of it differently because of Barbara and Dolores. Now, every Sunday in this church, I don't shout at you, "Who is Jesus?" If I did, you might think I'd had a stroke. But we do pray these words, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." If we really mean that, then we are praying for the most subversive of reversals to occur. People who live and pray this way have a very different agenda than any Caesar, than any king of this world, because we've pledged our allegiance to the reign of Christ the King, a kingdom where there is peacemaking instead of warmongering, liberation, not exploitation, mercy, not vengeance, care for the vulnerable instead of giving privileges to the powerful, generosity instead of greed, humility rather than hubris, embrace rather than exclusion. So what is Pilate to do with this man, Jesus, this king, whose kingdom is not from this world? And what, for that matter, are we to do with him? What does it mean for us to follow in the footsteps of this vulnerable king, this King of Kings who was poor Mary's little boy? How does pledging our allegiance to Jesus Christ as the King of our life lead to our being true to the challenge and risk of gospel living? Living as if Jesus reigns over our lives day in and day out, and not just for an hour here at church. For starters, it means that since Jesus was given to this world in an act of vulnerability, actually 2 acts of vulnerability. First, coming, where is she? As oh, there she she's under the table. So is Bill. So Jesus came as a vulnerable baby, just like Mary Ann, and he laid in a manger. And he was given again in vulnerability when he was killed in the greatest act of willing vulnerability this world has ever seen. We, the followers of this vulnerable king, must embrace rather than deny our own vulnerability. We must, as he did, forsake our love of power and embrace the power of love. We must forsake the love of power and embrace the power of love. These are words from someone I know a lot of you have enjoyed reading lately, that wonderful, iconoclastic, tattooed, foul-mouthed Lutheran pastor. Not me. I don't have tattoos. Nadia Bolz-Weber. And here's what she says. We don't need any more kings of vengeance or kings of worldly power. We need a king in a cradle. We don't need to put up our fists. We need to fall on our knees. And by the way, this is part of a sermon where she says her favorite Christmas carol is O Holy Night, because it says, fall on your knees.
That's mine too.
I know, I heard it got a lot of votes. So she says we need to fall on our knees, for that is what we do before a king. Fall on your knees before a God whose love comes to us in a delicate, unprotected, unarmed, defenseless flesh. Fall on your knees before the one who loves without caution, without measure, without concern for pre-existing conditions. I've never heard sin described that way before, a pre-existing condition. Fall on your knees before the one who submitted to the very worst that humans are capable of. The twisted thing in us, the thing in us capable of betrayal and flogging and violence and vengeance and even murder. And then not say, I'm going to get you back, but say instead, you are forgiven. In telling the story of Jesus' interrogation, I'm talking again now, still without tattoos. In telling the story of Jesus' interrogation by Pontius Pilate, this morning's lectionary is sliding us just a little glimpse of Lent, putting it on our radar screen before we march into Advent next week. before we move to the season of celebrating a light shining in the darkness. This week we're reminded what darkness is really like and why we need that light in the first place. Before we begin to prepare for Christmas, we are called to remember that we have more than just the baby Jesus. Has anyone ever seen the movie Talladega Nights?
Yes.
Do you remember them sitting around the dining room table and fighting about how you pray? And he wants just to pray to the baby Jesus because he's cute in his diapers? It's true, but that's not the only Jesus we have. We don't just have the baby Jesus. We have a sovereign Christ. And when we know what kind of king we have, it's then that we can sing with great faith on Christmas morning, "Joy to the world, the Lord has come. Let earth receive her King." Thanks be to God for that. And I think our hymn is, again, not what's in your bulletin, right? But 434. Our hymn is number 434.